December 19th, 1944. A freezing stone barracks in Verdun, France. 16 of the most senior Allied commanders in Europe are crammed into a single second-floor room, coats still on, smoke hanging in the air, a small coal stove in the corner losing badly against the cold. 3 days earlier, Germany had launched the largest offensive it had left in it, and nobody in that room yet knows how far it is going to go. What gets said in the next 90 minutes will decide whether Bastogne, a town most of them have barely heard of yet, survives the week. We're going to tell you everything about what was actually said in that room today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows will complicate the version of this story you already know. Now, if you're still here, let's start with why 16 generals were sitting in a cold barracks in the first place. Part 1. On December 16th, 1944, Germany launched what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, a massive surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, aimed at splitting the American and British armies and retaking the port of Antwerp before the Allies could recover. 3 days in, German columns had driven a deep, ragged bulge into the American front line. The fog and low cloud that had let them achieve surprise in the first place was still grounding Allied aircraft, and Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower needed his senior field commanders in one room, fast, to decide what the Allies were actually going to do about it. He chose Verdun, and specifically, the second floor of Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters, a stone barracks building historians have since described as dismal, heavy, and set in a sea of mud. 12 American and 4 British officers eventually crowded into that one room, among them Bradley, General Jacob Devers, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, Chief of Staff Walter Bedell Smith, and Patton himself. One notable absence tells its own small story about the weather that week. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the northern shoulder of the fight, was not there, and neither was his Chief of Staff, Francis de Guengand, who would normally have stood in for him. De Guengand was fogged in at an airfield in London, unable to fly to the continent, the very same low cloud that had let the German offensive achieve its surprise, now keeping one of the Allies' own senior representatives away from the meeting deciding how to answer it. The only heat in the room came from a small, coal-burning stove in the corner that the cold simply overwhelmed. Men kept their coats buttoned. Someone had arranged coffee and sandwiches on a table near a large wall map, and the officers sat on plain wooden folding chairs to hear what Eisenhower had to say, at a moment when nobody in the room could yet promise the map on that wall wouldn't need to be redrawn considerably further west. Eisenhower himself was not, by background, a battlefield commander in the mold of the men now seated in front of him. He had spent the interwar years as a staff officer and planner rather than a troop commander, and his entire role since 1942 had been to hold together a coalition of British, American, and other Allied forces whose generals did not always agree with each other, let alone with him. Managing personalities like Montgomery's and Patton's, often at the same time, in the same theater, was as much a part of his job that winter as reading a map, and the tone he chose to strike in that Verdun barracks, calm, almost theatrical in its insistence on cheerful faces, was the tone of a man who understood that his own mood in that room was about to become every other commander's mood within the hour. Eisenhower opened the meeting with a line that has been quoted in his own memoir, Crusade in Europe, and in nearly every serious account of that meeting since. The present situation, he told the room, is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. It was, by every account, a deliberate act of leadership rather than a genuine read on the mood in the room, an order dressed up as an observation, delivered to a group of men who had every reason that week to look considerably less than cheerful. By December 1944, Patton had already spent 2.5 years building the reputation that made him, alongside Eisenhower and Montgomery, one of the 3 or 4 most recognizable Allied commanders of the entire war. A reputation built on North Africa, Sicily, and the summer of 1944, when Third Army had broken out of Normandy and crossed France faster than almost any army in modern history had crossed anything. He was also, by that same point, a commander Eisenhower had already come close to firing once, over an incident in a field hospital in Sicily that had nearly ended his career outright, a history that made the two men's easy back and forth at Verdun slightly more notable than it might otherwise have seemed. George Patton, commanding Third Army, was the one man in the room who actually seemed to take the cheerful face's instruction at face value. When Eisenhower laid out the German thrust on the map, Patton reportedly offered his own read on the situation out loud. "Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up." Eisenhower's reply, calm and immediate, has also survived in the record. "George, that's fine," he said, "but the enemy must never be allowed to cross the Meuse River." It was not a rebuke so much as a boundary, Eisenhower granting Patton his aggression while keeping the actual strategic picture, protecting the river line and the wider Allied position, firmly in his own hands. Then came the question that mattered more than any line either man had already said that afternoon. Eisenhower went around the table, asking each army commander how soon he could go on the offensive to relieve the pressure building against the German flank. The answers were cautious, several days at minimum, understandable given the scale of what had just hit the American line. When Eisenhower reached Patton, Patton said he could attack with 3 divisions within 48 hours. The room did not entirely believe him. It is one thing to promise speed in a planning meeting, and another thing to actually move 3 divisions, their supply lines, and their axis of attack 90 degrees north in under 2 days, in winter, on roads already choked with retreating units and refugees. Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, reportedly pressed Patton on whether he understood what he was committing to. Patton held the number: 48 hours. By Patton's own later account, there was a stir around the table when he said it, a shuffling of feet, some officers convinced he was simply boasting, others visibly relieved that at least one man in the room sounded certain of anything. Turning to Bradley beside him, Patton is recorded as adding one more line that has survived in multiple accounts of the meeting, a piece of blunt confidence rather than polish. "This time, the Kraut has got his head in a meat grinder. And this time, I have got hold of the handle." If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Here is the part of this story that the popular version almost always leaves out, and it is also the part that actually explains how Patton could make a promise that sounded, to everyone else in that room, close to impossible. Patton's pledge at Verdun was not a flash of battlefield genius invented on the spot. It was the payoff of a week of quiet intelligence work that had already happened before the German attack even began. On December 9, 1944, a full week before the Ardennes offensive opened, Patton's intelligence officer, Colonel Oskar Koch, briefed him personally on a worrying pattern. German reserves, including armored and mechanized infantry formations, along with SS units, were massing in the Eifel region, directly opposite the thinly held American front in the Ardennes, and the terrain and troop concentrations Koch was tracking suggested the Germans, not the Americans, currently held the advantage in that sector if they chose to use it. This was a full week before anyone else in the Allied High Command took the possibility of a major Ardennes offensive seriously. Patton's response to Koch's warning, recorded in Koch's own post-war account of his service as Third Army's G2, was characteristically blunt. They would be in a position to meet whatever happened. He ordered his staff to begin outline planning for a contingency nobody else was yet planning for. That planning produced 3 named attack schemes, drawn up by Third Army staff before the German offensive even started. Contingency plans built for exactly the scenario Koch had flagged: an army pivoting north to meet a German thrust through the Ardennes. When Eisenhower asked Patton at Verdun how fast he could move, Patton was not doing arithmetic in his head for the first time. He was quoting a plan his own staff had already drafted, refined, and had sitting in a folder, built on an intelligence warning that predated the crisis by a full week. The 48-hour promise that stunned the room at Verdun was not a gamble. It was homework, and Patton was the only man in that room who had already done it. Koch himself is remembered today, among historians who study Army intelligence work in the European theater, as one of the more consistently accurate G2 officers of the entire war. A man whose staff's habit of taking enemy capability seriously, rather than dismissing it, paid off at exactly the moment it mattered most. It is worth sitting with what that actually means for the story being told in this video. The single most impressive thing Third Army did in the whole Bastogne relief did not happen at Verdun, in front of 16 officers, and it did not happen on the road north over the following days. It happened 10 days earlier, in a quiet briefing nobody outside Third Army's own headquarters found particularly urgent at the time, when one intelligence officer told his commanding general something the rest of the Allied High Command was not yet prepared to hear. Koch stayed with Patton's staff for the rest of the war, and later wrote his own account of that period, titled simply G2, Intelligence for Patton. A book historians researching the Ardennes campaign still cite directly for exactly the kind of granular, dated detail that turns a famous 48-hour promise from folklore into a documented sequence of decisions. There was one more piece of news in that cold room at Verdun on December 19th, and it belonged to Eisenhower rather than Patton. Word reached him that day that President Roosevelt had nominated him for the newly created 5-star rank of General of the Army, a promotion that would be formally confirmed the following day, December 20th. Eisenhower mentioned it to Patton, and what followed is one of the more genuinely documented exchanges of dark wartime humor to survive from that meeting. "Funny thing, George," Eisenhower said. "Every time I get promoted, I get attacked." Patton's answer came back without missing a beat.
"Yes," he said, "and every time you get attacked, I bail you out." That exchange is, in a very real sense, the closest thing this story has to what Eisenhower actually said behind closed doors after Patton's role in saving Bastogne, except that it happened before the relief, not after, in the same freezing room where the plan to make that relief possible was still being argued into existence. It was not a private confession, and it was not a hidden grievance. It was two exhausted men making a joke about promotions and disasters arriving on the same day, in front of 14 other officers, while 250,000 German soldiers pushed west against a line that had not yet decided whether it would hold. Patton left Verdun and did exactly what he had promised. Third Army wheeled its axis of advance 90 degrees, redirected the bulk of its combat power north, and began covering more than 100 miles of road in under 3 days. A logistical feat senior planners had considered close to impossible on that timeline. On December 22nd, with the 101st Airborne Division surrounded inside Bastogne, a small German delegation approached the American lines under a flag of truce, carrying a written ultimatum: surrender the town within 2 hours or face annihilation by artillery. McAuliffe's own reply, once his staff had turned his first spoken reaction into something the Germans could actually carry back to their own command, fit on a single line. To the German commander, nuts. The Germans needed the reply explained to them before they understood it was a refusal. While that exchange was happening at the edge of a surrounded town, Patton's Third Army was already moving to reach them. On December 26th, 4 days later, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, spearheading the 4th Armored Division, broke through the German ring around the town, the tank Cobra King leading the way into the American lines. The 48-hour promise Patton had made in that cold room at Verdun had become, 6 days later, a besieged airborne division reconnected to the rest of the Allied army. None of it came cheap. The roads Third Army's divisions used to cover that ground were the same roads choked with mud, ice, and retreating traffic that had made the rest of the Allied line so slow to react in the first place. And record cold followed by freezing rain and fog kept grinding down men and vehicles right up until the skies finally cleared around December 24th, allowing Allied fighter bombers back into the fight over the relief column's own route. Inside Bastogne itself, the wait had not been free either. By the time Abrams's tanks reached the American lines on December 26th, the 101st Airborne Division alone had suffered 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing or captured, defending a town most of its own men had never heard of 2 weeks earlier. Patton's 48-hour promise had been kept, but the 6 days it actually took to turn that promise into a broken siege were paid for, day by day, by men who had no way of knowing a plan already existed to come get them. What happened next between Eisenhower and Patton is where the popular legend and the documented record start to genuinely disagree with each other, and it is worth being honest about the gap. There is no surviving letter, memo, or diary entry in which Eisenhower privately singles out Patton for extraordinary praise, specifically for the Bastogne relief. And there is equally no documented evidence of Eisenhower harboring private jealousy or resentment toward Patton over it, whatever the popular version of this story likes to imply about generals competing for glory behind closed doors. What Eisenhower's own memoir does record is broader praise for the endurance of American troops across the whole Ardennes fight, snow, ice, and sleet included, rather than a Bastogne-specific tribute aimed at one man. What is documented, from Patton's own side, is a private frustration that had nothing to do with Eisenhower at all. In the days after the relief, credit and press attention for the northern shoulder of the fighting flowed toward Field Marshal Montgomery, who had taken temporary command of American forces on that side of the Bulge, while Third Army's own dash to Bastogne received comparatively less attention in the immediate coverage. Patton's diary from this period records him grumbling that it was most upsetting to receive only piddling criticism when he knew his army had done a genuinely good job, a complaint aimed squarely at how the credit was being distributed in the press and up the chain of command, not at Eisenhower personally. It is worth adding, for anyone checking this against Patton's published diaries directly, that historians have documented Patton revising and embellishing sections of his own diary after the fact, so entries like this one should be read as a real and broadly accurate record of his mood, rather than a verbatim transcript of his exact words in the moment. The real tension between Eisenhower and Patton in the war was genuine, but it belongs to other chapters of their relationship entirely, not to Bastogne. It belongs to the slapping incidents in Sicily in August 1943, when Patton, touring field hospitals, struck and berated two soldiers being treated for what was then called battle fatigue, an episode Eisenhower kept out of the press at the time, but used privately to warn Patton that one more incident like it would end his career, regardless of his battlefield record. It belongs to the argument over strategy and the race toward Berlin later in the war, when Eisenhower's decision to let Soviet forces take the German capital, rather than push Patton's or Bradley's armies toward it, left Patton privately furious about a political decision he considered a military mistake. And it belongs most of all to the spring of 1945, when Patton's public remarks about denazification in occupied Bavaria, comparing Nazi party membership to ordinary political affiliation in a country where both major parties fought for the same seats, cost him Eisenhower's confidence for good, and eventually cost him command of Third Army altogether, reassigned that October to the 15th Army, a paper command with the narrow job of compiling the official written history of the war in Europe. None of that tension is present in the Verdun record. What is present in the Verdun record is two men making a joke about promotions and attacks, in a cold room, 6 days before either of them knew for certain that Bastogne would hold. Part of the reason the popular version of this story drifts so far from the documented one is that most people have only ever seen it dramatized once, in the 1970 film Patton, starring George C. Scott, and that film's Verdun scene, while genuinely thrilling, is not a transcript. Historians who have compared it to the documented record have pointed out that Eisenhower himself is entirely absent from the film's version of the meeting, his real lines and role folded into a fictionalized composite general instead, presumably because the production could not secure the rights to depict a sitting Supreme Allied commander as a speaking character. The film keeps a couple of smaller, genuinely accurate details, including Patton firing his own pistol at a low-flying German aircraft strafing the area, and a bomb landing near the building during the meeting, both drawn from real accounts of that week. But the scene most people picture when they imagine what was said behind those closed doors, the version with Eisenhower himself squaring off against Patton on camera, is not what actually happened in that room. The real Eisenhower was there. The film's Eisenhower was not, replaced by a character built to carry his lines instead, which means the single most famous dramatization of this exact moment in Patton's entire career quietly wrote the real Eisenhower out of his own conference room. Historians who study the command decisions of the European theater have, separately from the Hollywood version, generally treated the Verdun Conference as one of the more consequential single meetings of the entire war in the West, not because of any one dramatic line spoken inside it, but because of how directly the decisions made there shaped the next 2 weeks of fighting. A slower answer from Patton, or a less finished set of contingency plans sitting in a Third Army folder, and the 48-hour promise simply could not have been made, whatever Patton's own instincts might have told him to say out loud in that room. The meeting is remembered as decisive because the plan behind it was already real before anyone asked the question that revealed it. What did Eisenhower really say behind closed doors after Patton saved Bastogne? The honest answer is that the version of this story worth telling happened mostly before the relief, not after it, in a barracks room in Verdun, where a promotion and a crisis arrived on the same afternoon and got the same dry joke. Eisenhower demanded cheerful faces from men who had very little reason to feel cheerful. Patton offered a 48-hour promise that sounded, to everyone else in the room, like bravado, and was in fact the product of a week-old intelligence warning his own staff had already turned into a folder of contingency plans before the German attack had even started. There was no secret confession of gratitude afterward, and there was no hidden resentment either. What there was, when the doors were actually closed, was two exhausted commanders trading a joke about stars and attacks, while the fate of an encircled American division 100 miles away was still, for a few more days, genuinely undecided. They remember a coal stove that could not warm a room full of coats. They remember Oscar Koch's warning, filed a week early and believed by almost no one outside Third Army's own headquarters. They remember a promise made in front of 14 witnesses and kept in 6 days. And they remember two generals making each other laugh, briefly, in the coldest room in Verdun, about the strange coincidence of a promotion and a battle landing on the same afternoon. Now you know what was in the file. Did your father or grandfather serve with the Third Army, the 101st Airborne, or anywhere in the Ardennes that winter? Tell us his name and unit in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.